go. Okay, take us away, Gautam.
So thanks so much, everyone, for having us, for having this paper. This is joint work with Frank Schilbach, whom you've heard from or will see more work by, Heather Schofield, who presented yesterday, and with two absolutely terrific PhD students, Pedro Besone from MIT and Matty Thoma from Harvard. So I think it's obligatory for any talk on sleep to start with the sentence, sleep is the most time-consuming activity of our lives, which therefore justifies our research. But perhaps it's worth saying that sleep is supposed to be the most time-consuming activity of our lives, and doctors say we should sleep 7 to 9 hours per night. And there's a lot of concern amongst experts about an epidemic of sleep deprivation in rich countries, because lots of folks, perhaps are not quite sleeping as much as that. And a lot of the evidence base for these statements come from either long-run observational studies that correlate your sleep with your health status, or a large body of short-run lab experiments. And these seem to make a very compelling case because they find severe negative effects of sleep deprivation on a range of outcomes. I think particularly interesting to this audience on measures of cognitive function, particularly simple and complex attention, alertness, reaction times, and working memory. Less so on things like fluid intelligence, and such. But also on a range of other outcomes, so happiness and subjective well-being. Some evidence there's starting to be from economists on sleep and decision making. A lot of correlational stuff on health, immune system function, blood pressure, so on, and some recent economics work on wages. So one thing that's worth noting about this evidence and that motivates our work is that nearly all the evidence is from rich countries, and nearly all the evidence that we would consider quote unquote causal comes from the lab. Now, why does it matter that nearly all the evidence is from rich countries? Well, there are tremendous differences in living conditions across countries. And if you look at sleep environments in the US versus say in India, which is where we work, you'll note that people sleep in very different conditions. Now, we actually know next to nothing about sleep from low and middle income countries. There's very little systematic measurement of sleep there, particularly objective measurement. But it's reasonable to look at these images and worry that people might be sleeping much worse given the difficult living conditions in developing countries. And given what we know from sleep science, we might therefore think the marginal benefits of increases in sleep might be quite high. Now, that's just a hypothesis. What is it that we do? We objectively measure sleep in Chennai, a major city in India, among about 450 participants who are hired to do data entry work for 1 month each. We then implement some randomized interventions to increase their sleep. We have some interventions that I think the key thing they do is provide either verbal encouragement and feedback, or that plus modest financial incentives to sleep more at night. And we cross-randomize that with a treatment which offers people a chance to take a nap precisely now between 1:30 and 2 p.m. for half an hour when at work, okay, in this data entry office that we set up. And then we measure the impacts of these treatments and the additional sleep they induce on work outcomes, so how you're doing at this data entry work, on lab measures of cognition, economic lab experimental measures of preferences and decision making, as well as physical and psychological well-being. So why is it that we're able to do this? Why is it that all this research has been in the lab so far and we're starting to move towards the field? It's because of these breakthroughs. Being able to measure sleep in the field using these actigraphs, which are wristwatch-like devices, they're kind of like Fitbits, which infer sleep from motion. And at least these these actigraphs are built for clinical research, and they're about 90% accurate, at least relative to wiring you up with a polysomnograph and measuring your brain waves and stuff. But we can have you just wear this thing. It doesn't interfere with your sleep. You can take it to your home. What this can measure is sleep quantity, and sleep efficiency. So what is sleep efficiency? It's the amount of minutes of actual sleep you squeeze out of your time in bed. So time asleep divided by time in bed trying to sleep. So that's what sleep efficiency is. What we don't see is things like, what stage of sleep you're in and so on. Okay, so this opens up the possibility of measuring sleep in the field. Now, our first finding is, in fact, that there is a terrific level of sleep deprivation in Chennai, a sort of shocking degree. So what I'm going to show you here is the histogram of the average amount you sleep in about, averaged over 8 nights for our sample. And you should be in this gray range, 7 to 9 hours per week. In fact, nobody is there. So it turns out that in Chennai, about on average, people are getting about 5.5 hours of sleep per night. This is a lot less than in the US, which is still not enough. So when you measure sleep objectively, physically using the similar devices, you find something like 6.25, 6.5 hours per night in the US. Okay. Now, the thing that's, we replicate these findings in another sample, a more representative, broader sample in Chennai. But the thing that's striking is that this is not because people aren't trying to sleep. People are actually spending plenty of time in bed. So they're spending 8 hours per night trying to sleep, and they're getting something like 5.5 hours per night of actual sleep. So why is this? What's going on? It's because sleep in Chennai is terribly fragmented, disrupted, inefficient, and just overall of really low quality. So this is what a typical night of data from the actigraphs looks like amongst our participants in Chennai. So red is when you're tossing and turning, and therefore the actigraph, and you're doing it enough that the actigraph is classifying you as being awake, and gray is when it thinks you're sleeping. So this particular individual spent about 7 hours and 45 minutes in bed, got only 5 hours and 20 minutes of sleep out of this. That corresponds to about 69% sleep efficiency. And they woke up 31 times a night for at least 2 minutes. And the longest uninterrupted stretch of sleep they got was only 45 minutes. Note that a sleep cycle is 70 to 120 minutes. That's to sort of get through the different stages of sleep. Here's what sleep should actually look like. This is an exceptionally good night of sleep from our sample. And this is kind of normal levels of efficiency and sleep episodes. But these are just extremely rare in Chennai. Okay, so that's our first and frankly, I think, most shocking finding. So when we show these results to sleep scientists, they're astonished. This is not something you see in rich countries. This is as bad or worse sleep than you see amongst people with sleep disorders like sleep apnea in rich countries. All right, so given that people sleep so little at baseline, can we help them sleep better? And does this translate into massive economic returns like we predicted? So here's how the study goes. People are in a baseline period. Everyone's going through the same procedures for the first 8 days where they're coming to the office, they're doing data entry work, we're measuring their sleep, getting baseline measures of most of our outcomes we're going to talk about. And then they get randomized to either a control group where we're not trying to change or improve their sleep at night. One group which receives some devices that you can take home, like a mattress, a pillow, eye shades, earplugs. We think those don't actually end up being very effective, don't get used very much, but they receive daily feedback and encouragement to sleep more. Another gets that plus modest financial incentives, 50 cents a day to increase their sleep compared to the baseline. I'm going to mostly pool these two groups together going ahead. So that's the night sleep treatment. But additionally, these guys get cross-randomized to this daily nap from 1:30 to 2 p.m. at the office. Now this raises the question, if you're not randomized to get a nap every day, what are you doing with that time? And here we're going to actually randomize within individual every day, whether you have the opportunity to keep working through that half an hour, or instead, if you're sort of given an enforced break, like this is a break from work. And so this way we can compare both what's the effect of napping on a given day compared to taking a break of the same length, kind of holding constant the amount of time we take out of your workday, as well as being able to compare what sort of the net effect would say perhaps an employer would care about in terms of your output compared to just working through those 30 minutes of the nap break. Okay. And each person is in the study for 28 days. So we have about 8 days of baseline data for each person and then 20 days in which they're being treated. So these are not very long run effects, right? But sleep lab studies are usually, in fact, the modal is actually 1 night. And then the longest tend to be, you can get a person to live in a sleep lab for a week, maybe 2 weeks. So this is longer than, almost all the lab experiments, but of course is shorter than a natural experiment, which is looking at variation in, sunset times or the like, which is, much more an equilibrium outcome. Okay. So our second finding is that, in fact, we can increase sleep with these treatments. We see, as soon as treatment starts, we see a marked and substantial increase in sleep on average across our 2-night sleep treatments, something like 27 minutes increase in sleep. That's on a base of about 5.5 hours per night. Okay. This is a pretty large increase in sleep, for example, compared to sleeping pills. So it's substantial. It's not getting people from 5.5 hours to the prescribed 7 to 9 hours or 8 hours per night, but it's a meaningful increase and then sustained over 20 days. Okay. Now, disappointingly for us, given that we gave people also things like pillows and eye shades and so on, there's no effect on what I call sleep efficiency, which is how many minutes of sleep you squeeze out of every minute you're in bed. Our treatments have no effect on that. What does that mean? That means the effect is coming out of spending more time in bed. We give you incentives and encouragement to sleep more. You go to bed a bit sooner, you get out of bed a bit later. So there's some opportunity cost here in terms of the things you'd otherwise be doing. We're going to show you later some of that comes out of labor supply. But there's other things, home production, leisure that you're missing, which we don't actually sort of measure or observe very carefully. But the low sleep efficiency means that it's a pretty high opportunity cost to get 1 more minute of sleep that takes you 1.5 more minutes in bed, or something like that. Okay. What about the naps? Well, the naps are super popular. On average, people get about 16 minutes out of 30 minutes of sleep. Objectively measured, self-reports are kind of similar. And about 90% of days, a person, both the actographs and the people say, yes, I did fall asleep during this 30-minute period. I should say we offer them like a safe, comfortable place to take a nap at work. So there's a little nap cabin with a bed and so on, which is private. Okay. A third finding is, despite these low baseline levels of sleep and the substantial increase in sleep our night sleep treatments generate, getting you to sleep more at night does not do anything for you across a range of outcomes. If we average across all the outcomes, it's sort of a zero effect. So you're not more productive, your labor supply goes down, which I'll talk a bit more about. There's no effect on measures of attention, which I'm going to tell you more about in a bit. And no changes in some measures of preferences, psychological well-being, maybe a little bit on exercise or physical well-being, but not much. In contrast, naps have positive effects on a range of outcomes. Here, positive numbers are all the things we've classified as good things. So for example, this would mean a reduction in your present bias. This means an increase in your savings, financial savings, and so on. Psychological well-being goes up. But for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on the work outcomes, the productivity labor supply outcomes, and measures of attention. So what do we find here?
Gautam, just a heads up, you've got 5 minutes left.
Maybe perfect. We'll see. Okay, so we built these data entry platforms and had people spend their days typing in boring data, which we chose as a task that we thought would require attention, because we really thought attention is what might be moved by, based on the sleep science, by sleeping more. This gives us also very fine measures of labor supply and productivity, keystroke by keystroke data. In our setting, people also get to choose their hours of work. You could zone out at work and no one's going to scream at you. You can show up late, leave early and so on. people are actually paid for their output, so they get some sort of hourly wage for actually being at work and working, plus they get a piece rate for the amount of work they get done. So there are some incentives here. So there's no significant effect of night sleep on productivity, although the point estimate is positive, 1.3%. Naps have larger effects. I guess these are not significantly different from each other. The effects of naps on productivity are statistically significant. Just to give you a sense of these magnitudes, we thought these are not large effects. They're not nothing, given that quadrupling your piece rate increase your productivity by only 10%. So compared to that, this is about a 2.5% increase in productivity from naps. Interestingly, you see these impacts throughout the day. So even before the nap, you're working faster, which could be because of cumulative effects. You're more rested over time, or you can work harder because you know you have this nap coming up. What about labor supply? Well, there's like a big opportunity cost of sleeping more, which is more or less neglected in the sleep literature. So what we find is, if you sleep 30 minutes more at night, you're actually working 10 minutes less. Those 30 minutes have to come out of somewhere, given that they're mostly, coming out of more time in bed. So there's less labor supply. And for the nap, of course, it depends. Am I comparing a nap versus a break of the same length, or a nap versus working through the same amount of time, right? It's almost mechanical. Similarly, then, when I translate this to your earnings, it's going to say sleeping more at night has an insignificant negative effect on earnings. And if you want to maximize your earnings, you should just work through the nap break. But do you want to nap, or do you want to take a break of the same length? Well, your earnings are going to go up if you nap, because you're more productive, right? Without the time cost being different. Okay, in the probably minute or two I have left, let me tell you about the attention measures. So we have a lab measure of simple attention, which is widely used by sleep scientists. In fact, they've done it with astronauts in space, which is kind of cool. It's called the PVT test. So they call it a measure of simple attention. It's also a measure of alertness and reaction time. So you spend minutes doing this awfully boring task where a stimulus appears on the screen and boom, you need to react really quickly. And how quick are you at that? Do you miss the stimuli when they appear? That's what the task is. And this is done in the afternoon. Okay, so naps may help you. Turns out more night sleep for 20 days does nothing to this measure of attention, whereas naps do a lot. Okay, so naps increase this measure of attention. We have another measure of attention, which is sort of inspired by the Chetty-Looney-Croft paper, which is about attention or inattention to salient incentives or taxes or prices. What we have is we have this piece rate variation every 30 minutes. You're working in a high piece rate or a low piece rate condition, and we randomize how salient those piece rate changes are going to be. Okay, so how does that look like? Well, either you're in a salient condition where your piece rate there at the bottom, that's in tabel, is a different color, it's always on the screen, it's hard to miss the piece rate. Or we put you in a non-salient condition where the piece rate is there for like a few seconds, it's in the bottom of the screen, you might miss it or you might forget it. So this could be attention, memory, either of these things. And we're going to see how much do you respond to piece rates on salient versus non-salient days, and how is that affected by treatment. So this theta inattention parameter that Delvinia has in his review paper, we find that people are sort of 15% inattentive to piece rates in the control group. Inattentive for the non-salient versus salient condition. You react something like 15% less, loosely put. Sleeping more at night doesn't change that, but the naps make you more attentive. You react more similarly on salient and non-salient days if you're in the nap condition. So I suspect I'm out of time. And so let me summarize. We've shown evidence of severe sleep deprivation among the urban poor in India, shown that increases in sleep are possible, but not sleep quality. At least we weren't able to do that. Contrast to expert and our own predictions, and I think striking contrast to medical literature, no effects of increased night sleep. We think that might be due to the really low quality of sleep we found, but it could just be that the findings from sleep labs do not generalize to the field when you are motivated through incentives. The sleep lab is almost all about keeping you up at night, and our thing is instead about increasing your sleep by a small marginal amount, which is maybe more policy relevant. So there may be asymmetries there. And then we found, we found these evidence that actually it's not that sleep doesn't matter at all, because these naps can have impacts on a range of important outcomes. We don't know why the naps have an effect when night sleep doesn't. It could be that the naps were higher quality because they were in the office. It could be because, they're just biologically different. It's a different time of day. And that's one of the many open questions in this agenda. Thanks so much. I guess I should stop now, and happy to take questions.
Hi, everyone. This is joint work with Senil Mulanathan, Swana O, and Frank Schilbach. So let's see. So the, a very consistent empirical finding is that the biggest predictor of being poor in the future is if you're poor today. And that empirical regularity has led to this really long-standing hypothesis that maybe there's something about poverty itself, some feature of poverty that can lead you to remain poor by lowering your earnings. And so then the key question is, well, what feature of poverty could it be that can lead to that kind of persistence? And so most of the work in economics that's tried to answer this question has focused on this idea that, well, maybe there's some sort of productive investment that the poor just can't afford to make, like get good schooling, and that's what keeps them poor through lower productivity. And of course, these kinds of channels are surely super important in helping explain this empirical finding. But in this paper, we're going to try to expand our list of potential explanations and add and look at another possibility, which is that there could be a psychological cost that stems from the experience of poverty. That when you're poor, you have a lot of financial burdens, and those financial burdens can become mental burdens that you carry with you in the form of worry or stress or sadness. And when you take those burdens with you to work, they can make you less productive at work and can make you earn less. And so what we're going to try to do in this paper is empirically test the relevance of that idea using a field experiment with low-income workers in India. And so just to motivate, could this kind of channel actually be empirically relevant? I just want to show you some survey data from our sample, which again is low-income workers. And where, if you just ask workers, well, how worried are you about your finances? And in our sample, 85% say very worried or quite worried. And half of them say that they worry about their finances. These things rise top of mind every day. And just about everybody says at least a few times a week. So that's through a prompted question, and we can do something even less direct and ask people, well, just at the end of the workday when people are working, we just say, hey, just tell me what you were thinking about today. What kinds of things came top of mind without any prompts or any direction? And then if we just code up the text from those answers, what we see is that half of workers just completely unprompted mention worrying about their finances while they were at work. And here we're just showing a text analysis that tries to look at, well, what are the most common words that emerge when people are talking about, these worries? And you can see things like daily expenses and loans loom pretty large. So of course, this doesn't prove that financial strain or these mental burdens actually make you less productive, but they do indicate that this is something that's operable when people are working. They are there in the back of their minds. So we're going to try to test this idea more rigorously. And the specific question we want to know is, well, if you relieve the financial burdens that a person faces, can that make them more productive at work? And we're going to do that with a field experiment with manufacturing workers in India, where we're going to alleviate their financial constraints and then look at their effects on their productivity. And then we're going to use very precise data on features of the production process to try to get at underlying channels of what's actually changing. So there's, of course, this burgeoning literature lately that's thinking about these kinds of channels, that there could be psychological effects of financial constraints. And for the most part, this literature has looked at impacts on laboratory measures, like, well, does that impede your performance on a Raven's matrix test or make you say that you feel sad in a self-reported scale? So we're going to expand that by showing evidence on field behaviors, by showing that we can go beyond the lab and this actually affects people in a very core domain, which is their labor productivity and earnings. And this really complements this sort of more black box literature that's already out there that looks at programs that give people transfers and shows that that leads to increases in wealth. And we're helping unpack the black box and saying, well, some component of that could come from these kinds of psychological channels. So in our experiment, we're going to look at actual earnings in the field, but really be able to use our design to rule out these kinds of physical investment channels and really focus on psychological channels. One thing just to note is we're not going to really take a strong stance on what the specific psychological channel is. Is it stress or worry or affect or depression? What we are going to show you is positive evidence that these effects that we see on productivity are mediated at least in part through some sort of attentiveness. So to the extent that being less sad or having less worry makes you more attentive at work, that seems to be the kind of thing that is at least in part driving our results. So we're going to have 400 workers, all males, who are employed in the experiment full-time for 2 weeks. We're going to use the infrastructure from my Morale Effects of Pay Inequality paper, where what's really common in the setting is that there's an agricultural lean season where people don't do agricultural work, and then they get these short-term contracts to do non-agricultural work. And so in our setting, their contracts are going to be to make disposable plates, which are a really ubiquitous consumer product in this setting, that are made by stitching together tree leaves. I'll explain more in a little later. And so, so they come in, they make these plates, they're paid for the number of accepted plates they make, and those quality standards are set by a contractor, and then everything they make is sold in the local wholesale market. So from the perspective of these workers, this is just a normal job. And this setting is really nice for us to look at the question we're interested in, because we're going to look at a population with really large financial concerns. So about 83% have outstanding loans, and I showed you already how much they think about finances. These workers are going to be paid piece rates for production, so that if we change their productivity, that translates into direct changes in their earnings. So they're very motivated to work as hard as they can. And the production task we pick is quite cognitively challenging. So to the extent that these psychological mechanisms are relevant, we might expect them to manifest in this kind of task. And then we're going to be able to very precisely measure output and attentional markers of the production process. So the way the experiment works is that, so we're going to have two primary groups, a control group and a treatment group. And so people arrive on day one, they're just getting trained, getting used to how things work in the job site. And then we pay them at the end of day one just a training wage for that day, both to build trust that, in how things work, and because it's just training on the first day. And then for the control group, they get the remaining period payment at the end of the contract period on day 12, which is pretty normal for contract jobs. And then what we're going to do for the treatment group is one small mild change, which is that what they've earned up until day 8, they get paid on day 8. So they get some of their payments early, and then they get whatever else is left on day 12, just like the control group. And so what this does is this induces an easing of financial constraints at this point in time relative to the control group, keeping overall wealth constant. And the amount of this early payment is actually really large in our setting, and that's because this is the agricultural lean season. So people are generally, if they weren't employed by us, would only be working 1 or 2 days a week. So if you look at, just a comparable population and what they would actually make in a month, the amount of cash that people are taking home in day 8 corresponds to about a month's worth of what they would make if they hadn't been employed by us. So that gives us the scope for these early payments to actually change people's financial constraints meaningfully. And so what we're going to then do is just to look at what impact that has on people's productivity just by comparing productivity day 8 onwards in the control group and the treatment group. And we actually announce what the payment schedule is before day 8. So this is not a surprise payment. People are told on day 5 what their announcement schedule, when they'll actually be paid. So people are told on day 1, on day 5, we're going to tell you what the payment schedule will be. On day 5, the treatment group learns you're actually going to be paid early. And that allows us to separately look at the news effect, the announcement effect of this, differentially from actually receiving the cash. And that's going to be really important in helping us think about confounding explanations like gift exchange, or maybe a part of the treatment effect, which is that maybe anticipating getting cash already leads you to work harder versus actually getting it. Whereas the previous literature, like Money et al., have really found that getting the cash and actually being able to spend it is when effects seem to kick in. So we'll be able to have both of those two margins in our study. So I'm going to just walk through then our core set of results. The first is, do we have a first stage? And so here, what we do is we survey people after that early cash date. A couple days later, we just ask everybody about their expenditures in the past couple of days. And what we find is that the treatment group has a massive increase in their probability of paying off loans. So if you just look at the probability of paying off a loan, that goes up by 40 percentage points off of a base of 18%. So this is over a 200% increase in the probability of paying off a loan, and almost a threefold increase in the amount that people are spending in paying off debt. So these people come in with huge debt overhang. They qualitatively say this is a source of stress, and then when they get money, they immediately go out and they pay off loans. And if you look at heterogeneity by underlying wealth, what we find is that the effects seem to be larger for, this is the effects for people who are below median wealth or have a lower wealth in our sample. So lower wealth people tend to have more propensity to pay off loans, though we see it across the sample for both poorer and richer people. All right, so people get money, they go, they pay off loans, they also spend on other things like buying food and so on. And so then what happens to their productivity in the workplace? And so here the dependent variable is just normalized output. So this is just their production and standard deviation. So this is the number of accepted leaf plates they produce, so what they're actually getting paid for. And what we find is that productivity on average goes up by about 0.124 standard deviations. And interestingly, these effects are entirely concentrated among the poorer workers in our sample. So here in column 5, I'm just showing you a split by above and below median wealth in our sample. And so for the below median wealth guys, this is a massive 0.2 standard deviation increase in their productivity. And for the richer guys, we actually can't reject that there's no effect on their productivity at all. Okay, so people become more productive. And so now what could be driving this increase in productivity? Well, our hypothesis was that this could be mediated through a psychological channel. So I'm going to first show you positive evidence for the channel we have in mind, and then I'm going to look through, later go through some other explanations that aren't psychological in nature. So, to get a sense of what could be going on, the previous literature has done things like, well, just looked at measures of cognitive function, like giving you a Raven's matrix test. What we're going to do is actually use the fine-grained data we have to look into the black box of not just how much people are producing, but how they're producing, and that we're going to use that to try to get an insight into what's actually changed in driving this increase in productivity. So here's an example of what people are doing. So they're making these leaf plates, which this is the back of a leaf plate. So this is something that if you go to almost any roadside tavern or mid-range or low-range restaurant in our setting, you're going to eat your lunch off of plates like these. So the way they're made is that you take individual leaves from a local tree, you stitch them together with little bamboo twigs. So here's like a little stitch right there. And in order for the plate to be accepted by the contractor, for you to be able to get paid, this has to be in a round circle. It can't be oblong in shape. It can't be too big. It can't be too small. There can't be any holes or gaps so that it can actually hold curry. And then the stems of the leaves shouldn't be visible, so they have to be covered by another leaf. But because each leaf is irregular in its shape, it's really easy to make mistakes and not satisfy these criteria, which might mean that you have to like undo what you did and fix it if you want that plate to be accepted, or if you want to be paid for that plate. So then, given the nature of this task, and the reason it's cognitively challenging is that planning and strategic placement can actually really improve your productivity by reducing the amount of work you have to do. So you could, if you want to make sure there's no holes or gaps, you could just use a lot more leaves so that everything is covered, and so there's no way for there to be a gap. Or you could think ahead and say, okay, well, if I'm placing this leaf here, I should place this other one here, and that'll ensure that there's not going to be a hole or a gap. Or similarly, what you'll see people doing is they start making these leaves and then they notice the shape isn't becoming round. It's like kind of veered off and become oblong. And so then as a result, people will have to undo that and fix it so that it's actually round. So if you were planning and thinking ahead, you can actually complete that plate by using fewer leaves and fewer stitches, so there's less time and work involved, and there's gonna be less of a chance for you to have to undo a mistake. And so that means that for the same piece rate, because your piece rate is just based on whether you made the plate that was of acceptable quality, you can use less physical time and effort to make that plate, and as a result, increase your earnings. So So what we're going to do is translate this into 3 measures of attentiveness in production. The first is we actually can look at mistakes, because when you remove a stitch to undo a mistake, this leaves a telltale sign, which leaves like a double hole where the stitch was. So basically there would be a hole here and a hole here because you had to remove the stitch where you put it in. And so we can count the number of double holes in the plate. And we can also count the number of leaves you use and the number of stitches you used. And we collected these measures, and that was unknown to workers. So workers didn't even know we were collecting them, but by collecting them, we're able to get a sense of how attentive people were in production. And so what we find is that on average, the treatment group shows more attentiveness in their production. And again, just like the productivity effects, these effects are entirely concentrated among the poorer workers. So among poorer workers, there's a 0.23 standard deviation increase in this attentiveness index. And again, we can't reject no change for the richer workers. And so the takeaway is
just a heads up, we've got 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So with early cash, workers are working more efficiently. They're having to undo fewer mistakes. And this is consistent with this thing of, well, you use less minutes per plate, and so then you get to make more plates in the day and you maximize your piece rate earnings. And just note, this is the opposite of what one might expect under something like gift exchange, because by having better attentiveness, by using fewer leaves or making fewer mistakes, they're actually working faster and maybe exerting less care per plate, but getting to their goal of making more plates per hour. And just one other note about this measure is that there isn't like some sort of mechanical correlation between being more attentive and having higher output. And the way we can test that is at the end of the experiment, we randomize the piece rate that workers face and also change the base wage to keep their overall wealth constant. So that generates an increased return to effort, but no change in wealth. And then as we predict, we see output going up. So people work harder when the piece rate is higher, but we don't see a change in attentiveness. And so that suggests that this change in attentiveness that we see isn't mechanical, and in fact, it's involuntary. So you can't change how attentive you are by working harder, but we do see change in that when we've relieved your financial constraints. These effects are persistent until the end of the contract period. So we have several days of data after we give you the cash, and we see that the effects persist the whole time in both on productivity and on attentiveness. Just so then to quickly go through, that's the evidence that's consistent with our positive predictions, but what about some other potential reasons why people might improve productivity from the cash drops? So one set of explanations could just be that people, we've changed people's beliefs about their employer or their dynamics with the employer. So maybe that people now feel the people who got cash early have some gift exchange motive, and that's why they're working harder, or they feel the control group feels they were treated unfairly by not being paid early, and so that's why they reduce production, and that generates our effects. And so when we look at announcement effects, we find no evidence that being told you're going to be paid earlier versus later changes your productivity. And so even if you think that really you have to be paid for these effects to really manifest, we'd imagine if they're really operable, if they're leading to these massive changes in productivity, we might expect to see some change then when you're actually given the news about when you're going to be paid. And you would also need to know a reason why that would be concentrated among poorer workers and not richer ones. Similarly, we have some features of our design that allow us to rule out trust in the employer. And then we also look at investment channels. We can rule out just by virtue of our design, this can't be that the cash lets you buy some physical input, like a machine or something that makes you more productive, but maybe you can invest in more nutrition. And we do see people increasing how much they spend on food. We can rule out, though, that that's driving our results basically by looking at a couple of things. The first is that, if you go home and eat more food, it's not going to make you inherently more productive the next day. Like that's just not the way biologically it works, but it could by having more food in your stomach in the morning. Maybe there's a blood sugar effect that can keep you going. But what we find is that the effects aren't concentrated in the mornings when people come to work having eaten breakfast. They actually last the whole day. And we look at measures of breakfast consumption, and that's pretty inelastic in this setting. So we don't see changes in that. So we really don't see evidence that nutritional changes could be driving, or food consumption changes could be driving our effects. So then the final set of thing I'll quickly go over is just to follow the previous literature. We also did a priming intervention where we tried to increase people's attention toward their financial strain. So people had to talk about what loans they had outstanding and tell us how they would come up with funds in an emergency. And we cross-randomized that with the early cash treatment. So some people got primed when they were still cash poor before the cash drops, and some people got primed after the cash drops. And overall, the effects of this are ambiguous, is what we predicted. But what we pre-registered is that we would expect the effects to be more negative if you're primed when you're cash poor relative to when you're cash rich. And we do find effects of that, though they're just shy of traditional significance levels. But overall, actually, priming people to think about their finances made them more productive. So the effort response sort of dominated. And the effects we found, though, were concentrated among those with more loans. So it seemed like we really primed people to think about loans rather than primed people to think about financial constraints or poverty more generally. And so overall, I think our priming results, we find them a bit hard to interpret, and our conclusion really is that perhaps it's more reliable. As you know, we're not the first to point out, there's a big literature on issues with fickleness of priming. Perhaps it's better to use attention as an outcome like we do by and actually have real earnings variation versus using attention as a treatment by priming people. So then just to wrap up, what we're finding is that there's this direct relationship that goes from having cash on hand to how productive you are. And that supports this idea that poverty itself could be detrimental for earnings and puts forth this additional channel through which that could arise. And through our attentiveness evidence, this really suggests a role that psychological channels are at play, that something that's operating through attention is leading to this change in productivity. So this has potential implications for how we think about policy design. If you alleviate financial constraints, in addition to letting people go and buy more schooling, this could directly alleviate the psychological constraints that they have. And so this might be a reason why various programs like cash transfer programs might not just improve welfare, but could also have productivity benefits for the poor. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, hi everyone, and yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties. Thanks to the organizers for making this happen, and very delighted to discuss two fantastic papers. I will discuss them individually at first, and then bring them together at the end. Starting with the first paper, which is taking place in an urban setting in India, where both the quantity and the quality of sleep are really strikingly low, and asking the question, can increasing sleep yield an economic return? To answer that, experimental methods are used with a night treatment consisting of information, encouragement, and devices, and then layered on top and mostly pooled are financial incentives. In addition to this night sleep at home, there is a cross-randomized nap at work. And to look at work outcomes, there is a data entry task used. And yeah, what is quite neat about the study is that they have objective sleep measures coming from actigraphs. Next slide. What do they find? Looking at the first stage, both treatments are successful at increasing sleep quantity, not so much quality. If you can just go to the next slide. Looking at some other, looking at outcomes, with work outcomes being productivity, labor supply, and earnings, we find some differences between the treatments, with the night treatment not having much or if anything an unintended effect, whereas the nap is increasing productivity. The night also doesn't have much of an impact on a range of other outcomes, whereas the nap is increasing attention, psychological well-being, and some form of patience, although that's not surviving multiple hypothesis testing as of now. In conclusion, the returns to a more night sleep quantity are low at this given quality, while returns to nap are potentially higher. Moving on to comments consisting of looking at the measures. To me, given that you have the separate labor supply and earnings measure, having this relative weighting didn't make, it wasn't the most intuitive for me, looking at just the number of entries would have been a more natural quantity measure of productivity, and looking at correct entries would have been some kind of quality adjusted measure. And then looking at number of mistakes as an alternative, more task derived measure of attention, where in the next step, looking at their response to piece rate variation or penalty rate. You have this really neat time-stamp productivity data, which I think you could be exploiting even a bit more to get also at this notion of timing versus quality, and looking at the differences between the night and the nap sleep, where you could have an hourly estimates, looking at, is there morning versus afternoon, is the divergence driven just in the afternoon. Next. I think overall I was a little left unsatisfied with the explanations for these differences between night sleep and nap, and I think you might share this. I think it was really a pity that you didn't include the nap into this expert survey to see if experts would have predicted that there could or even should be this difference. Looking at this time variation within morning versus afternoon might help you to get at that quality versus timing. But yeah, overall, given that this nap, and I think you've refrained from that in some more recent iterations, given that this nap is only a 30-minute thing, pushing too much for quality differences, I would be a bit careful. And just like looking at the point more below, I think personally I was surprised of the similar productivity effects of taking a nap compared to both working through working or taking a break, where I think coming in with a prior that a break might have some attentional benefits. Next, I think what could potentially be added is this component of awareness of effects of sleep deprivation, both looking at in the model, I think currently assuming that agents are fully aware of the effects that sleep quantity and quality has on their productivity, which in turn has implications for their labor supply decisions. Yet there are several empirical pieces suggesting that this full awareness is not necessarily given, ranging from the survey, your own elicited beliefs, more revealed take-up measure of these devices, and just leaving me wonder, like, what's the role of awareness and perception? Next. I think overall for me, the major weak spots of the paper is this explanation of a mechanism. I'm wondering if there's some scope for mediation analysis, which would also help make the paper a little leaner. You're not pushing for sleep quality so much anymore. For me, if anything, sleep quality would have rather been a pre-mechanism, in the sense that there's sleep quality, productivity, and then there's something in the middle, which very well could be attention. That could be explained a little further, both in the data and potentially incorporated in the model, given that there is a response of productivity to incentive in a given day. So for given sleep quantity and quality, is suggesting that there might be, that workers have some margin on that. And then, finally, some comments regarding conclusions and potential implications. I think I was really curious, or I was surprised and puzzled that sleep quality is so low, and was wondering what would it take to improve sleep quality. Is it actually using these devices that you provided, other devices, or tackling these environmental factors? And what are the implications for the firm perspective? Should they be encouraging naps at work? With that, I'm moving on to the second paper, which also took place in India, although more in a rural setting, with an exclusively male sample of day wage laborers during the agricultural lean season, where financial constraints are more binding, and asking, do financial concerns impact worker productivity? again, using some experimental methods, slightly shorter time horizon, where the main randomization is the timing of the income receipt, meaning some are being paid earlier than others. In addition, there is a cross-randomized priming where people get reminded of their own financial concerns, and there is some variation when this priming is happening. And then for a subset at a later point, there is a randomized piece rate for the manufacturing task that they're using. And what I think is quite neat is that they have a task-derived measure of attention, which consists in these attentional errors in production. So what do they find as a first stage after getting this early pay? Shifts your expenditure patterns, with the big chunk being used to repay loans and credits. So there is some some of the financial concerns are alleviated that way. Throughout, there's some heterogeneity by baseline wealth, with stronger results for the poor, and that's also true for the increase in worker productivity and attention, which is the suggested mechanism. So yeah, in conclusion, or the conclusion is that poverty can reduce earnings capacity through cognitive channels. Yeah, I think I found it striking that loans are such a common feature in the setting, and yet such a major source of worry, that I think I would have found a little bit more descriptives about the loan and credit environment in this context helpful. And also trying to understand a little bit better the determinants of financial worries and the impacts. Next. Yeah, I think you also have similar comments to before. You also have this very nice timestamp data that you're currently underutilizing. So one suggestion could be to look at treatment versus control in daily frequency, having productivity and attention outcomes side by side. 3 series with overall above and below median wealth, and that way getting at the announcement versus payment effects in graphical form. Regarding the attention measurement, so yeah, I think it's quite neat that you have these task-derived measures. I've adapted a version of this task myself at some point, kind of played around with it. So I'm wondering if these are these really markers of inattention, or could using more stitches also be a sign of trying to produce something of higher quality as opposed to poor planning or focus. In my adaptation, I had more variation in the piece rate, and I got really a stark response to them. So I'm wondering if your piece rate variation was just like not powerful enough, if the base rate component was too large compared to the piece rate. And yeah, in general, I think raises the bigger question about appropriate measurement unit of attention. Okay, then regarding conclusions and implications, I think you could—
Isabelle, I know you started late, but it would be great if we can kind of wrap up soon. I think you're close.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. I have this one, yeah. So you can elaborate a little bit more on the link that you suggest between financial strain, attention, and productivity, be it in works or in a model, looking at workers' choices and constraints, internal versus external, thinking a bit about implications in terms of payment frequency and business case for cash transfer or UBI. Next, please. So yeah, both papers make important novel contributions. They share an agenda in the sense that they're looking at or estimating a causal relationship between poverty and worker productivity. They're also bringing forward this idea of a potential circular relationship. And one paper more than the other, attention is the suggested mechanism. Both are really using clever experimental variation in a nice field setting. Yet there are some open questions and potential next steps for research, starting with measurement and quantification. Yeah, the priming didn't really work. The SEEP probably had its own challenges. inducing variation isn't always easy or ethical. But more importantly, I think we don't have a standard measure of attention yet that has also a good quantitative interpretation that we can not just say that there is an effect on attention, but we have a magnitude that we can compare across studies. Both are highlighting or bringing forward the idea of a poverty trap, but there could be done more to follow up on it, following either the nutritional approach has now been picked up by Johannes Haushofer for a psychological poverty trap. And yeah, I think there's sleep and financial worries are just two examples. There's also noise, heat, light. There's always various hardships that the poor are exposed to that all have the potential to rob attention. How are they all combining? Are the effects just adding up? Are they compounding? How can attention link all these individual studies? And yeah, where and how do policymakers start? What would be the best lever? And that's all. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking about the difficulties, and thanks so much to Supreet for doing that.
So Dimitri, you're ringmaster.
Well, we're in the Q&A, so Supreet and Gautam, do you want to briefly respond to Isabelle, and then you can choose some questions from the Q&A to answer, and we can go into the break as well to keep talking.
Supreet, would you like to go first?
Okay, thanks, Gautam. I guess Isabelle, thank you for that, and Isabelle also was very kind in sending lots of other comments on the paper. So those are super helpful as we're preparing the paper. So thank you for that. I think I'll just touch on a couple of things. So I think a lot of the suggestions of things to try were excellent, and we're certainly planning to try them. I think one thing you had asked about, just in terms of the empirics of we have multi-days of effects, why aren't we showing kind of like a graphical analysis? And just the short answer to that is just that in order to rule out confounds, we had to design the timeline in such a way that it's really hard to stack things. So for example, some people were paid on day 8, some people on day 9, because that is important to rule out the trust confound, but then that creates different time lags between when things are announced, when things are paid. So you can't just do one simple event study diagram to look at things. We can present things in separate ones where we line up everything on day 0 with one thing or another. And so we've done that, and I think it just matches what you see in the tables. But that's why we don't have that. It's just because it's not possible to do one for the whole paper. I think the more substantive comment was just how do we think about the measures of attentiveness that we have? Your idea was, well, maybe this is a sign of more quality, that if I use more stitches, I'm making a better quality plate. And I think that's certainly possible, but that's really a confound for us. And if what you want to say is that, well, there's some gift exchange motive, that if you're, the employer pays me, and so as a result, I'm trying to create a better quality plate. But that actually would predict the opposite direction of the effects we have, because if that were true, then the attentiveness index would be negative rather than positive after the cash drops. So I think the pattern of our results suggests that what we're measuring is not that. And I think the fact that we, about our piece rate variation, the piece rate variation we have is strong and salient enough to get real changes in productivity. So it wasn't that it wasn't meaningful to workers. Workers saw those piece rate changes and they worked harder. And so we do see an impact on productivity. It's just that we don't see a change in attentiveness measures, suggesting that they're less movable, they're less elastic than the productivity measures. And then I think it'd be great to talk to you about what you did in your setting, and we can compare notes offline later. I think there are some questions in the chat, but before I go to those, Gautam, do you want to respond to, or I guess Dimitri, how do you want to do it? But maybe it makes sense for Gautam to
let's let Gautam respond briefly, and then we can do the Q&A part.
Yes, thanks again, Isabelle, including, as Supreet said, for sending us as well a number of very helpful comments. And sorry to have made you read this old and extremely long version of the paper. We tried to get a revised version, but of course we failed predictably. So I'll just pick a few of the many interesting questions you asked. So one is about the role of beliefs and misperceptions. So you had exactly the intuition for what we thought we were going to be able to do. We thought we'd find wow, there are these enormous effects of getting people to sleep more at night, which also experts, sleep scientists predicted, and actually some economists predicted for us, and we predicted. And then we would be faced with the question, well, why on earth do people not just sleep more then? Because these things are in principle in their choice sets. And then we were going to measure people's beliefs. And we thought we'd show people just don't get it. They don't realize the effects are so big because you kind of need a number of days of better sleep. And, so all of this is hard to pick up against other fluctuations. But of course, in a way, that's all obviated by the fact that sleeping more doesn't actually do anything. So we think it's actually the thing that's in your choice set, which is spending more time in bed at night, doesn't help. It takes time. So there's sort of nothing to explain in terms of misperceptions. Now, naps are effective, but naps are also popular and common. Your workplace may not allow you to do it, but if you had the option, people nap quite a lot in India. So the thing that, that's not in your choice set has high returns. The thing that is in your choice set doesn't. So it's very sort of standard neoclassical econ, which is certainly not where we came from. We thought we'd find a bunch that's interesting on beliefs and misperceptions. Another question is sort of the worker and firm perspective. Like, so should we do naps? And Rosemary Nagel as well asked this. Well, from the firm's perspective, I think potentially yes. Now it depends. In the end, there's less output. But one thing I didn't mention is over the course of these 4 weeks, the naps get more and more effective. You start to get even more and more productive being in the treatment group. So maybe that would continue. By the end, you're kind of breaking even. Now, we've not done a calculation of, the rent cost of having space with like beds in it and all of that. But, if your workers are happier, have more self-control, pay more attention, as productive, then maybe that is a good idea. But, we don't have a strong view. We think for workers, it's less clear, like, night sleep clearly doesn't make sense. We're not sure if they would like to do naps or not. It'll be interesting to find out. But finally, one thing about mechanisms. So you ask, what are the mechanisms here? A narrow view of that question is, so why is it that night sleep has no effects, but naps do? And there we think one thing is, the naps in our setting, because they were in the office, could have been higher quality, or they were higher quality by some measures. But an alternative is just, they're in the right part of the circadian clock. Like being sleepy in the afternoon is a very biological and real thing. There's a reason you're sleepy in the afternoon. And so napping might just be quite effective. There's other work on that in sleep science. I think sleep scientists have mostly argued that what matters is the total amount of sleep you have in 24 hours, and we seem to reject that. But mechanisms it really depends what field you're in, what counts as a mechanism. So Frank and I have been working with psychiatrists recently, and what we call a mechanism, they call a behavior. They want something neural. So I used to be very interested in mechanisms, and I used to be the person asking in seminars, what's the mechanism? And telling my grad students, we got to nail the mechanism. But I've gotten a bit disillusioned with that, because I think whatever you show, people can ask, but what's the real mechanism? And so I think we were in a space where we feel like basically we knew nothing about this. Like no one had measured sleep in developing countries like this. We had no idea about what the effects would be. So we were sort of, it was kind of blind. So I think this paper is really not trying to get mechanisms. But we'd love to do more later, or at least mechanisms as economists would consider them. But I frankly I don't know what mechanisms are anymore, at least in this context. Dimitri, you're muted.
Oh, I was just going to propose. How about Supreet, you take a few minutes to answer whichever questions you want, and then we'll run into the break a little bit, but then Gautam can take a few minutes to choose questions from the Q&A chat as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll just take maybe a couple that in my quick reading were prominent. So a really quick thing that Gautam I think pointed out that I wanted to highlight, so that we look at this heterogeneity by poor and rich, but everybody's poor in our sample. Like these guys are all quite poor. The markers for wealth in our sample are like, do you own land? So these are really meaningful markers for wealth. But I think the way to think about our results, one view is that then there's a poor versus rich split. Another one that I think is very plausible is not that these things aren't relevant for the relatively richer people in our sample, but that we just had a smaller first stage for them. So we give a certain amount of money. If you don't own land, that's just a much bigger impact on your ability to pay off loans than if you have land, and so you're richer, and so you have bigger loans, or so on. So I don't think one should say, so I think either of those two explanations are possible, and they're both consistent with our mechanism, so I don't think we have a view. And then Dimitri, you had asked, I think, about how should we think about this distinction between a psychological mechanism and not. And I think you're pointing out a really good distinction. And so perhaps the way I would do it is to go back how I tried to frame things on the first slide, which is that in economics, the way we think about what can lead to poverty traps or persistence is like the ability to afford certain types of investments that can raise your productivity. Like you can buy a bed net so you don't get malaria, you can buy better schooling, you can buy a machine, or so on. And those things are going to make you more productive. And what we're basically arguing is that those are not things that are going on. So when I say psychological mechanism, what I just mean is it's something that's arising internally to yourself. So if you're less stressed, and so that makes you physically able to better sleep at night, that's fine because it's arising through the lifting of the psychological constraint. So I think that's how I would view that distinction. And we can clarify that, I think, in our language a little better. And then very quickly, the last thing is Johannes and others also asked about pay frequency. And so, you know, our design doesn't really let us get at pay frequency. And I kind of wrote an answer to Johannes in the chat. But essentially, if you think about it, these are people in the lean season who haven't been paid a lot in a really long time. They have a lot of loans. We come in, we give them a month's worth of money. They can go pay off loans. So that's very different than if we had paid them every week versus every 2 weeks if you're like regularly employed. So the way one should think about our paper is not about like the difference between pay frequency 1 week versus 2 weeks. It's really about a test case for if you just alleviate constraints, do you move productivity? And that's really as far as what we can go to say. I got them. Turn it over to you.
I think the questions here have been answered mostly. I'm happy to let people get a break, but if anyone has more questions, I'm also happy to take them. The questions in the chat, I think Frank has already answered.
I guess I just want to push on a little bit in on Isabel's question about the currency and the definition of an attentional channel and the quantification of such a channel. I think that, and I don't know, you know, this is like wide open. I think it's an incredible set of findings. It's got something to do with you operate more poorly in the environment and you, as it were, you discriminate worse. And, you know, I'm trying to stitch a plate, I do a worse, something is going wrong. And I believe that, you know, at the point where we're trying to kind of recover something that's underlying all of these, we will want, you know, there to be more standardized measures. I can't tell what they are yet. So, for example, it was very interesting watching the question of, is it about the decline, going back to an earlier talk, way earlier? Is it about how quickly you decline? We can all start the day pretty well, but you know, if I'm attentionally, if something's gone wrong with my sleep, you're going to watch a pattern in my productivity, literally minute by minute, which is what you're going to watch the decline. I'm exhausting my capacity to perform well. So I think that there's going to be, you know, if we could agree a set of, well, that's really, you know, the way we measure the failure of attention to operate well. That's how we quantify its decline. I just would feel like, and then, you know, in relation to incentives too, because that's that clearly they can have an effect. You can force your attention a little bit. So it strikes me as like super rich, but it in a way, too many options.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think what I would say is that I think these two types of measures are getting at two really different dimensions of attention. So in my paper with Heather, what she presented yesterday, you know, we show these declines, and there we're really trying to capture the idea of sustained attention. And I think psychologists, in you know, the taxonomy of attention that they have, would say there are just, you know, depending on which psychologist classification you want to use, there's like 3 or 4 different kinds of attention. So sustained attention or vigilance is one kind, and I think it would be wrong to expect, or what they wouldn't think that the way you measure sustained attention should be the way you measure like some sort of instantaneous attention. So I guess what I would say is I completely agree with you. We don't have standardized measures, but that's maybe what's exciting. This is kind of very nascent in this field where we're—
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
I'm not thinking, it's not a critique that we should have them without going through the hard work.
I guess what I would say is I would posit that looking at performance declines is a good way to measure sustained attention, and that is something we should see, in lots of settings. I think the instantaneous attention measures are just super, super hard. And even when you ask like a psychologist, like how would you measure attention, like their definition is so semantic. It's like attention is your performance on this attention test that I use to measure attention, and that's super hard to interpret. So I agree with you. It's like we don't have a standardized measure, but I think that we kind of have to fumble our way into it. But I think one thing I do find kind of encouraging or interesting is that in both those papers, so in the paper with Heather on sustained attention and declines, and on this paper, in both cases, piece rate variation, trying to incentivize people to do better on the task, doesn't move the measure of attention in either case. And so that at least, so I feel like through these independent attempts, we are starting to find things that seem consistent.
But I don't find that necessarily a positive thing about a measure of attention, that it doesn't respond to incentives.
I see. Fair point. Fair point. Or I guess it depends on the kind of theory you're testing. So I guess for allocation theories, that makes sense. For like I guess the paper with Frank is about the involuntary direction of attention or capture of attention. So that's one would predict. But you're right, for other kinds of work like that Dimitri or your others have done, you would expect it to move. So that's a fair point. I
mean, you put it differently. I mean, if you don't pay, people don't attend. That's very, very, very common. There are many jobs I'm currently not doing, and I'm also not getting paid for them. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's apparently having a big effect. I'm not really getting paid for being here, but it does a lot of other stuff for me. So.
We're paying you with smiles.
Oh, exactly. All right. I agree that I should have left everybody alone. And that we should have a few minutes off if people need it. Of course, I don't, so I could keep talking forever.
Andrew, have you measures of attention that you like? Like, have you seen direct measures of attention and field behavior that you have found to be?
No, it's kind of interesting though, because one nice thing about the abstractions that are involved in, let's say, what you're doing in most learning type tasks is updating. It's kind of how well can you update. So this is not physical at all, it's absolutely mental. So you're giving me a question on a test, and when you're very tired, it's A through E is the answer. When you're very tired, I expect you to take a long time and make a lot of errors. And so that's the kind of but if I said to you, but this is the one you better answer, it's 10 times more important, then A, I dedicate more time to it, but B, per unit time, I might be able to do better. So there's all kinds of, can I increase the flow rate? And something like when you're doing that, it's an as if cost. Because there's some kind of like, well, I traded off, I did it early and it ran it down. So a resource I was moving down. I think there is a cost formulation for most internalizations. Otherwise, you do it perfectly. I don't know but the question of what's being costed up is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the simplest thing that you do in rational attention theory is you cost up moving from a prior to a distribution of posteriors. But that's kind of very, very, that's very limited vision of what it is that you're doing. So I had a prior that A through E were equally likely as the multiple choice answer. I read the question, I gradually got the sense that maybe it's D, maybe it's E. I'm kind of exhausted. I'm hitting D, I'm going to be wrong a lot. I'll get you know, but if I really gave it more time, I might sort D and E out more accurately. And if you look at the pattern in my answers, you'll see it's as if I had internalized the information better with the greater intention. I don't know. I hardly even know what I'm talking about.
I mean, generally speaking, though, I mean, this is just going to sound extremely reductionist and economicsy, but you know, most decisions can be reduced to there's a cost function to obtaining a certain kind of benefit. You know, there is a marginal benefit curve and there is a marginal cost curve. You know, in addition to marginal costs, I guess we want to think about the fixed costs as well. And shocks to attention can be coded as basically shocks to the cost of production function, you know, whether it's kind of producing test performance or producing labor, as in the two papers that we saw. And if we do take such a reductionist framework, you know, we always know how to monetize the cost of production. And so that would then suggest that any shocks to attention can similarly be put in the common numeraire of money in terms of what they have to imply to the reshaping of the cost of production. I mean, is that not a, you know, and then you can compare, you know, and there might be different inputs. You know, you can have a 10-dimensional cost function, but you can always still reduce it to a 1-dimensional one, because at the end of the day, the 10-dimensional one is just telling you what is the net cost of obtaining, you know, 1 unit better of performance. You know, in psychology.
So that's music to my ears. I mean, I think in the my own guess is that in the end, these psychological cost functions, broadly construed, are more important than physical production functions, and that we will be learning about them till kingdom come.
You know, I mean, how can it be any other way unless people are just doing random stuff that has nothing to do with, you know, cost benefit whatsoever. You know, but the fact that people get an elastic,
that's why Dimitri and I get
violating but
we both say reductionist things.
Anyway, I think we can continue this later. I think it's time for Ben to talk about the social determinants of choice quality. And Ben, I thought you were going to wear a tux today.
I was going to, but then I decided that would be too ridiculous. I chickened out.
I'm pretty sad.
I know. I really thought about doing it, and then I thought, what am I doing?
It would have held our attention, Ben. It was really a lost opportunity.
I know. I've been sending to
my attention to Ben is an elastic. It's
got it.
Complete. So
I've been sending Dimitri emails about how well I'm going to dress, and then I just wore a boring shirt. Are we?
Okay, well, that came out of your time. You have 19.
Oh, are we ready? It's time. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's too bad because I have a lot of slides.